Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Connections Online 2021. I'm Chris Weave. I'm the conference director, and I have with me Sean Barnett, who's an old wargaming friend of mine. We've been wargaming together for the last 20 years, including the time we were playing World War II in real time. Sean's here to talk about a wargaming game that he ran that happened to, it was not caused by the necessity of everybody locking down, but it happens to fit in really well with the theme. So I'm now going to turn it over to Sean, and he's going to talk to you about his Gettysburg campaign. Over to you, Sean.
Well, thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody. I'm Sean Barnett, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Gettysburg campaign, the American Civil War, and multi-blind wargaming. More specifically, I'm going to talk about a multi-blind game that Chris mentioned that I ran from last May to October, and the insights that can be drawn from that on multi-blind gaming that are relevant not just to the Civil War, but also to modern wargaming. With that, let's get underway. So this is what I'm going to cover today. I'll introduce myself. I'll tell you a little bit about the historical Gettysburg campaign, why you would want to do it as a multi-blind game. I'll talk about the game itself, what I use to run the game and rules that I developed to enable the multi-blind aspect of it. We'll summarize gameplay, so hopefully you can see where the multi-blind aspects of it came into play and made a difference. And then at the end, I'll go over some observations and insights into multi-blind gaming in the campaign. And at the very end, I'll be happy to take questions and participate in a discussion. This is me, Sean Barnett. I'm a defense analyst, nuclear engineer, attorney, and longtime wargamer, longtime friend of Chris also. Right now, I'm a senior engineer at the RAND Corporation. I've been a defense analyst for much of my career, going back into the late 80s. I'm a scenario book author for a couple of wargame scenario books for the Firewall Forward game system, covering the Battle of Villers-Bocage in Normandy, and also Operation Epsom in Normandy. I've been a playtester for several published games, and I'm also a regular game master at East Coast wargaming conventions. And lastly, I have to say all the views I'm expressing here are my own, not my employers or the U.S. government's. This is the Gettysburg campaign, the historical campaign. It Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North in June or July of 1863. And the campaign started with the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and the Union Army of the Potomac facing off against each other at Fredericksburg, which is at the bottom of the map. At the beginning of the campaign, the Army of Northern Virginia began to move west, then north, up through the Shenandoah Valley en route to Maryland and Pennsylvania. And after some delay, the Army of the Potomac, under General Hooker at that time, began to move north up through central Virginia. You can also see on the map, if you see the dashed red line, that's Jeb Stuart's ill-fated ride around the Union Army that took place during this time. Now, what happened in the campaign is that with Lee's head start, one of his corps under General Richard Ewell actually moved into Pennsylvania and was able to march east, excuse me, to get to the Susquehanna River up there at the top of the map, both at Harrisburg and then east of York. But when the Army of the Potomac finally entered southern Maryland, Lee consolidated his army, and the armies came to blows at Gettysburg on July 1 through 3, 1863, and that's the battle you all know about. So why play this campaign as a multi-blind game? Why not just put the map down, put the counters on the map and play it that way? And the reason is that during most of the campaign, the armies were not in contact. It was over 35 Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where Lee, Longstreet, and A.P. Hill were located on June 28th. And it's over 50 miles from Frederick to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and York, Pennsylvania, where Ewell's two divisions were located at the same time. So what that meant was that much of the campaign was actually a battle for information, the two forces trying to find each other without being found. And what that meant that they were using several means to try to do that, to participate in that, to win that battle. Cavalry reconnaissance and counter reconnaissance. They were using scouts and spies. Union Signal Corps long-range observation stations, other means of intelligence. And then to compound the problem of not being in contact and having limited means of intelligence, communications at that time only took place at the speed of a horse or a telegraph, which limited the ability of commanders to convey the information that they had to each other, and caused everybody to operate in a situation of limited information. And the reason to do this multi-blind is that face-to-face games just don't model that very well. Typically, there's far too much information available to the players. And if you see the game played face-to-face with everything on the table, you can see that they're maneuvering in ways that the historical armies didn't, because they're taking advantage of information that they have that the historical commanders did not have. The advantage of the multi-blind game is that it puts the players in the shoes of those historical commanders with overriding concerns about the unknown. So this was the game, and I'll tell you about how I did that. And essentially, the game was run as a Kriegspiel, where the commanders are just expressing what they want to do in words, and I'm providing results of their moves to them in words. But underlying that, I was using ASCRU rules from a couple of board games for completeness, consistency, and fairness, for the benefit of the players, and to ensure that I had a complete and really full game experience for everybody. I used MMP's Great Campaigns of the American Civil War, the two games, Roads to Gettysburg 2 and Stonewall Jackson's Way 2, which were put together to cover the battle area of the campaign. There's also a campaign overlay that's been written called The Long Roads to Gettysburg, written by Ken Lee, that essentially links those games together and provides some other measures to enable the campaign to be run as a multi-week game. But on top of that, the multi-blind elements and additional campaign elements, I had to add myself to enable the game to be played multi-blind. And we covered the campaign from June the 3rd at Fredericksburg until the intent was to cover until Lee's retreat back into Virginia, or some other event that triggered an instant victory for one side or another. And as I'll show you, that actually happened during the game, and I'll get to that when I cover what happened. The scale of the game was infantry divisions. The units were infantry divisions and cavalry brigades. The turns were daily. The map scale was about 1 mile per hex. And the victory conditions in the game were capturing strategic objectives and inflicting losses on the other side. The game was implemented by email and mostly by Vassal, although that was really up to the players, the means that they would use to track their units and the information they had as the game went on. And Vassal was a very convenient way of doing that, but you could do it with map encounters, you could do it with photos, or however the players chose to do that. To make it multi-blind, there were several things that I had to do. First of all, I had to recruit players to represent the commanders at the level of decision making. This is commanders who were acting on their own information in the campaign. So to do that, I had an army commander for both sides, infantry corps commanders, and cavalry brigade commanders. And that was 29 players in all. And I was able to do that, reaching out to my wargaming friends, and that was great that we were able to assemble all those people to run the game. There were also non-player commanders on the Union side who were not part of the Army of the Potomac, and I ran those commanders, and I'll talk about them a little bit later on. Provided for information collection from both sides, both by direct observation and by other sources. It was essential to operating in a limited information environment. Provided rules for communication in person and by telegraph with speed and bandwidth limits. Provided for small unit operations. Cavalry patrols in particular were very important to the campaign. Logistics added to those rules to more literally represent the impact of logistics on Army operations. Provided for simultaneous movement and combat, because the board game itself did not do that. It had a system where you would move one unit at a time, but I allowed for simultaneous movement and combat to better represent what was actually happening during the campaign. And then finally, provided a system for submitting orders and players receiving results. And here were the players in the game. Again, Army, Infantry Corps, and Cavalry Brigade commanders, 29 in total. You see the Confederates there on the left and the Union on the right. And we had players for all of them. And notably, on the Union side, we also had a player covering the Colonel George Sharp, who was the commander of the Union Bureau of Military Information, who was responsible for collecting and analyzing intelligence for the Army of the Potomac. And it turned out that that was a really critical role in the game and very helpful to the Union Army. We also had non-player commanders, and in particular, they were General Halleck in Washington, and also the department commanders for the Union Army in Washington, Baltimore, and Harrisburg, who were not part of the Army of the Potomac, and I ran those commanders throughout the game. Information collection is a critical part of the campaign, and also participating in a multi-blind game. There are several ways that the Union and Confederate armies used to collect information on each other, even when they were separated by great distances. There were cavalry operations that were really the primary means of collecting information from both sides, although didn't always work as well as intended. The Union in particular, historically, their cavalry did not perform as well as it should have. There was prisoner interrogation after battles. That was an important source of information where you could learn enemy orders of battle, and even future plans sometimes were divulged by prisoners. Scouts and spies. Spies could sometimes operate far behind enemy lines and also gain important information on future plans of the commanders when they could infiltrate enemy units. There were organized civilian scouts on the Union side. These were networks of civilians who reported on Confederate movements in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and they turned out to be important in the historical campaign and also in the game. There were local citizen reports of an ad hoc nature in towns and villages that commanders of both sides would rely on when they would come into an area. There were friendly civilians, civilians friendly to both sides, who would tend to inform them on recent movements of enemy forces. Sometimes those reports were reliable, sometimes they weren't, but I provided them in the game. The Union Signal Corps operated observation stations, which were detachments equipped with telescopes that they would typically deploy to mountaintops to observe Confederate movements in the distance. Specifically in the campaign, they had observation stations deployed to South Mountain that could see the Confederate infantry corps as they were marching over the Potomac. And so that provided valuable information to the Union Army historically. And in the game as well, the Union Army used them to good effect to observe distant movements of Confederate forces when they didn't have combat forces that could observe them directly. There were newspapers that were relied upon by both sides, and operational security was not what it was in the 19th century. It was not what it is today. And so the newspapers sometimes provided fairly detailed and pretty timely reports of what was happening in battle areas, and commanders could rely on them. And then finally, there was the sound of artillery fire, the guns, that would sometimes cue commanders into fights that were taking place within a few miles of their position, and I provided for that as well. Now, on top of that, they had all these sources of information, but sometimes the reports or information that the real commanders collected was bad, it was erroneous, and I provided some plausibility for bad information to be provided to the players in the game. And so the net effect of all this historically was that the Union did have something of an edge over the Confederates in capabilities that gave them historically an edge in situational awareness. And we'll see that as it played out in the game, that also manifested here. On the right, you see a sidebar about the Bureau of Military Information, which is the Army of the Potomac's intelligence analysis organization. And it was really the first all-source intelligence organization created for the U.S. military, and they collected and analyzed information and provided it to the Union Army commanders. And that was important to the historical performance of the Union Army, and also important in this campaign as well. With respect to communication, the speed and bandwidth at that time was limited by the technology. You had messengers who were riding horses, and then the telegraph for the Union Army, and they were limited in speed and bandwidth, and messengers, of course, could be intercepted. The telegraph was limited to established lines intended to run along railroads, but those lines were subject to cutting. There were also issues on top of the technology that limited the efficiency of these means of communication. There were organizational limits caused by the performance of headquarters and the U.S. Military Telegraph Corps that sometimes they would operate less effectively than even the technology of the time would allow. And so that just made it a little more difficult for the players to communicate. And the way I implemented that in the game was by rules on email messaging that limited the players to which the other players could send messages, and also sometimes delayed their delivery to represent the speed of the technology of the time. Also created rules for small unit operations and logistics. As mentioned, small unit operations, particularly cavalry, were very important to collecting information and trying to prevent the enemy from collecting information. Also scaled down the cavalry combat rules to allow small units to fight, and then provided spotting rules for units as small as patrols to represent their capabilities in gathering information. Logistics were an important limiting factor on Army operations at the time. Ammunition supply, food and forage supply were tracked by the board games, but to that I had to add wagon, train, transportation, and road movement rules, because it turned out that these wagon trains took up a lot of space. For example, the Union Army Corps on a road might be 7 miles long, which is about 7 hexes on the game map. And the Union Army, the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia trains in total were over 50 miles long. And so those were things that the real commanders had to manage and that the players had to manage, and provided real limitations on what they could do with their armies. And finally, didn't track this originally, but small arms ammunition actually became an unexpected game issue when there was a unit in the game that was in so many fights that it would have drained its small arms ammunition historically had that happened. So we had to improvise that during the course of the game. We provided rules for players ordering and sending orders, and then implementing the results of the game moves. Player orders were submitted by email every day, and they provided narrative descriptions of their unit actions consistent with the Kriegspiel nature of the game. They also included the messages that they wanted to send to more distant commanders, and they would be delivered at the appropriate time when those messages would have reached those commanders. They provided contingent orders to resolve possibilities like encounters with the enemy that they might run into during a day that they didn't expect. The movement and combat orders I translated them into impulses to allow simultaneous resolution, so that it was simultaneous in the sense that players could order their units to move during a day, but the timing in which the moves would occur during the day were determined by the game rules, and an impulse system provided for that. Resolve combat using the GCACW rules based on the player narratives that they provided. Results of moves were transmitted by email every day, including combat results, observations, and communications. And it turned out that I could run a turn in about 3 to 7 days of real time, depending on what was going on in the game, and also depending on what was going on in real life. And on complex turns, there was a large volume of material. I think the biggest single turn, I had 18 pages of single-spaced material that I had to provide to the players, and so sometimes it was a lot of work, but it was all worth it. It was an enjoyable experience. The game moves were recorded every turn using vassal files, in addition to the written results of the moves, and we also had I also saved the player email communications, most of which I had copies of. And then finally, we did a debriefing after the game to try to capture the players' intentions and what they knew, and the reasons for their decisions. And so that was an interesting session. And this briefing reflects some of that information that they provided during those debriefings. So now I'm going to go through a quick summary of the events of the game, just so you can get a sense of what happened, and hopefully an understanding of how intelligence was bearing on the moves made by the players. And so you know, with these maps, Union units are indicated in blue, Confederate units are indicated in tan. The corps are identified numerically, Roman numerals for the Union and Arabic numerals for the Confederates, and smaller units are indicated using the first or the names of the initials of the last names of the commanders. This is the beginning of the game, actually the end of turn one, the first day, where you see the Confederates have begun to move west from Fredericksburg with elements of Longstreet's Corps, that's Hood's division, leading a column, and then behind that, the 3rd Corps, commanded by A.P. Hill, heading west, ultimately en route to the Shenandoah Valley. The Army of the Potomac is still defending on the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg. They haven't started to move yet. And so intelligence-wise, both sides knew of the starting positions of the other. They had been in those positions for some time. The Union also had a balloon at Fredericksburg that it could use to observe the movements of the Confederates as they departed to the west. Now, unfortunately for the Union, they did not bring the balloon with them for the rest of the campaign, so they didn't have its services, but they did have it for a little while while the Confederates were still located around Fredericksburg. This is a situation 4 days later on the end of turn 5. This is the second day. What's happening here is that this is the second day of a rainstorm that's moved through the area, that slowed the movement of the armies. It's also made the rivers impassable, which has caused some trouble for the Confederates. You can see there in the south, the 3 units with green letters are the 3 divisions of Ewell's Corps that have gotten separated, and one of the divisions has gotten tangled up with Union cavalry, and then the Union 12th Corps there just north of the Wilderness at the toward the bottom center of the map. Otherwise, in the upper left, you have the Confederate 3rd Corps heading for the Shenandoah Valley, and then Longstreet's Confederate 1st Corps moving northward, heading for the Loudoun Valley. The Army of the Potomac is beginning to move north and west at this time in response to the Confederate movements. Intelligence-wise, the Union was able to observe the movement of the 3rd Corps and Hood's division near Culpeper using agents and Signal Corps observation stations, although the movement away from Culpeper was obscured by the rain for a couple of days prior to this moment. The Confederates are in contact with the Union 12th Corps and cavalry just north of the Wilderness, but they're not in contact with the rest of the Army of the Potomac. And also, as you see, the Confederate Corps are starting to separate, which is going to cause some issues, some command and control issues for the Confederates as the campaign develops. This is a situation 3 days later, and you see at the upper left that the Confederate 3rd Corps has now moved into the Shenandoah Valley and is beginning to advance north up the valley per their campaign plan. And you see that the 1st Corps under Longstreet, those units indicated in orange, are moving north up the Loudoun Valley. And in the south, Ewell's 2nd Corps is reorganizing around Rappahannock Station after a battle with the Union 12th Corps, which is down there facing off against it with some cavalry. Otherwise, you see the Army of the Potomac slowly moving northward. The Army of the Potomac has also deployed its 3rd Corps under Sickles to Leesburg by ship and by rail in response to the Confederate movements to the north. Intelligence-wise, again, the Union Signal Corps has the 1st Corps under Longstreet under observation. They're in contact with the 2nd Corps down in the south, but they're not exactly sure of what happened to the 3rd Corps under Hill because they lost contact with them in the rain, and they don't have an observation station that's looking into the Shenandoah Valley to see its movement. The Confederates, the 3rd Corps is scouting Berryville in the Shenandoah Valley. They're in contact with the Union cavalry at Snickersville. You see there in the upper center of the map. John Mosby's Rangers are reporting on the Union cavalry presence at Warrenton, and then the Confederate 2nd Corps in the south is in direct contact with 12th Corps. But otherwise, the Confederates do not have information on where the Army of the Potomac is going. And you'll see that as the campaign continues, that they typically did not have information on what was happening in the rear, so to speak, away from close proximity to their units. This is a situation one day later, and you see in the upper left that Third Corps has now overrun the garrison at Berryville in the Shenandoah Valley, and that will provide some information to the Union on where the Third Corps is. The First Corps under Longstreet has made a feint to the east. That's Hood and McLaws divisions are feinting to the east to try to convince the Union that the Confederates are aiming to drive potentially on Washington or on Baltimore. They've made contact there with Union cavalry and infantry forces. So you see the 11th Corps is the infantry there next to McLaws division. And in the south, you have the 2nd Corps slowly moving northward from Rappahannock Station in contact with Union cavalry and also still facing off against the 12th Corps. But in the middle of the map there, you see in eastern Loudoun County, you have the 4 Corps of the Army of the Potomac that are not in contact with the Confederates, and so they don't know where they are. And specifically intelligence-wise, the Union will learn of the presence of the Third Corps in the Shenandoah Valley by virtue of its attack on Berryville. They're in contact with the First Corps and Second Corps, so they have a pretty good picture of what the Confederates are doing. The Confederates have scouted the Harper's Ferry garrison. The Confederates have captured some scouts from the Third Corps, so they are aware of its location, where it is now. Mosby has also provided further reports on Union Corps and cavalry near Warrenton, and that's around where the 2nd Corps is on the map. And in the south, they're recently in contact with the 12th Corps, but there's still 3 Union Corps that they're not in contact with. So the Union, again, has an information advantage at this point in the campaign. Now we'll take a look 3 days later, and you see that Lee and Longstreet, First Corps there in the north, have crossed the Potomac, and A.P. Hill's Third Corps has actually taken Harper's Ferry at this time. The Army of the Potomac is consolidating, half the Army of the Potomac is consolidating around Leesburg there, you see, and then in the south, you see the 2nd Corps is starting to move northwest, slowly moving toward the Shenandoah Valley, but they're faced off now by 5th Corps, 12th Corps, and 2nd Corps, and the Union cavalry. So the Union's starting to build up forces to oppose or pursue the Confederate 2nd Corps. Intelligence-wise, the Union's in contact with the 3rd Corps in the north. They observe the 1st Corps using Signal Corps observation stations, and they're in contact with the 2nd Corps in the south. The Confederates obviously were in contact with the Harper's Ferry garrison. They had recently contacted the 11th Corps at Aldie, which is a little bit south of where the Union Army is located on the map. Confederate agents have reported the presence of Union artillery south of Leesburg a couple of days prior to this what's indicated on the map. And Mosby has provided a report of 4 Union Corps near Aldie, but that report is also 4 days old at this point. And so the Confederates have some information on where the Army of the Potomac is, but these are old reports. And so again, the Union retains an advantage in situational awareness and observation of where the enemy is. Now, this is a situation 2 days later. And you see that in the north, that the Confederate Third Corps has moved into West Virginia to take Martinsburg. The Confederate First Corps is consolidated around Harper's Ferry, and they've sent Hood to the east to take Frederick Junction. The Army of the Potomac has made an interesting decision. General Hooker made an interesting decision at this point. Rather than pursuing Lee, Longstreet, and Hill into Maryland, he's decided to try to defeat Ewell's 2nd Corps that has been maneuvering slowly toward the Shenandoah Valley. So you see 4 Union Army Corps headed for the Shenandoah Valley, and the Union 6th Corps just to the south there has actually made contact with some Confederate cavalry. That's Ashby's Gap there, where you see the little engagement taking place. In the south, again, 2nd Corps, Confederate 2nd Corps is headed for the Shenandoah Valley, being pursued by 2nd Corps, 5th Corps, and 12th Corps. And so that's really sort of put the development of the campaign in motion, and that's going to have significant implications for the results that you'll see shortly. Intelligence-wise, the Union obviously is aware of the fall of Harper's Ferry. The Signal Corps is still observing elements of 3rd Corps and 1st Corps. Union agents are observing 1st Corps as well. The cavalry, Union cavalry operating off the map to the east, have reported no contacts east of the Monocacy River. So the Union has a fairly good idea that the Confederates have not yet made a dash to the east to try to take Washington or Baltimore. And so they can rely on that in making their decisions. Union patrols and agents have observed the 2nd Corps near Salem. So they see the 2nd Corps' movements toward the Shenandoah Valley. The Confederates are in contact, or were in contact, with the Harpers Ferry garrison. They're in contact with Union cavalry patrols north of Warrenton. This is the 2nd Corps. And the 2nd Corps also finally at this point receives the report from 4 days prior of the 4 Union Corps near Aldie. So that they have some awareness of where the Union Army has been, but they don't have current awareness of where the Union units are, and that's going to have implications shortly. This is a situation a day later, and you see at the northern end of the map that the 3rd Corps has finally crossed into Maryland at Williamsport, and they've actually taken Hagerstown. In the north, the 1st Corps still consolidating at Harpers Ferry, but Hood has moved further east to take Frederick, Maryland. The Army of the Potomac has moved into the Shenandoah Valley, and you see 11th, 3rd, and 1st Corps have completed those movements. And then in the south, you see that the Union 6th Corps and 2nd Corps have contacted the Confederate 2nd Corps around the town of Rectortown, and it's going to develop into the battle that ultimately decides the campaign. You see also in the south, 5th Corps and 12th Corps pursuing 2nd Corps as well, and then a lot of Union cavalry. It's 2 Union cavalry divisions supporting that operation. And so this is something of an inflection point in the campaign, that the 2nd Corps has drawn a lot of attention from the Union Army, but the other Confederate forces are essentially uncovered by the Union Army at this time. That, as we'll see in the next set of slides, that Lee, Longstreet, and Hill right now have a free hand and could make a decision to go essentially where they would like to go, and what decision they actually made right now. This is a situation 5 days later in the north end of the battle area. This is a map of Pennsylvania and central Maryland. You see that Lee, Longstreet, and Hill have moved up the Cumberland Valley in the direction of Harrisburg, and Confederate cavalry has actually taken Carlisle. And at this point, they are moving unopposed. The Union Army has some Pennsylvania militia that's gathering around Harrisburg, but otherwise there are no Union units in vicinity of the Confederates operating in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Nonetheless, the Union Army does know where, or at least is getting reports on where these Confederate forces are operating, using their agents, and importantly, using the network of civilian scouts that was established in central Maryland and Pennsylvania. Every time the Confederates move through a town, they're generating reports that they're sending to the Union Army headquarters, so that the Union Army commanders know that the Confederates are moving up the Cumberland Valley, and they've not yet made a dash toward Washington or Baltimore, which could have been highly consequential to potentially lose those important population centers. The Confederate intelligence picture is less well developed. In the South, obviously, 2nd Corps is aware of the Union Army forces converging on it and making contact with it. But in the North, Lee has only belatedly become aware of what's happening to Ewell, and that Ewell is in danger. And we'll see now, this is the southern end of the battle area. This is around and this is in Fauquier County, around the town of Rectortown and just to the east. And what you see is a result of the Battle of Rectortown, where the Confederate 2nd Corps was attacked by some forces, really, of the Army of the Potomac. And this is the end result of it being attacked by Union 1st Corps and 3rd Corps after attempting a breakout the Union has inflicted enough losses on the Confederates to cause Second Corps to rout, which has triggered army demoralization for the Confederate Army, and through that they have triggered an immediate Union marginal victory under the conditions of the game, the rules of the game that are provided to the players. So that concludes the operation of the game, and hopefully you were able to see how the information available to the players enabled them to move in certain ways, and also the information they did not have caused them potentially to get into trouble in certain instances or not take advantage of opportunities that they might have had. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit, say a little bit more about the impact of the multi-blind game. It did have a strong influence on play and the outcome. The players said that it had a very different feel from a face-to-face game. The players made a lot of effort conducting intelligence gathering operations, and in the gameplay, they were counting on the absence of observation to shield their movements at times. And sometimes they declined to advance out of concern for the unknown, what might have been out there that they didn't know about. In some instances, they put their forces at risk from unknown enemies. In some cases, they made feints to try to induce enemy reactions, counting on limited information to get the enemy to react to something that they might not have intended to follow through on. And then finally, there were instances of potential opportunities that were unseen that the players did not take. The biggest single factor in the outcome of the game was a superior Union situational awareness created by intelligence gathering capabilities. And I think the Union concluded that their most valuable player was the player who was running the Bureau of Military Information, and that's General Sharp there on the right side of the image. That the work that he did in pulling that information together and providing it to the commanders was really of the greatest value and contributed highly to their success. So there were some issues that came up in running the game, and there are always issues that come up in running games, but you're running a big, long multiplayer, multi-blind game. There was the time required to run the game. Obviously, we spent 5 months doing it. It took time to execute turns, but we were able to manage. We kept it going, both the players and I, through to the end. There were the players themselves had to recruit 29 players to play. Sometimes they related to each other well, sometimes less well, and so that either helped or hindered the performance of the armies on either side. And then there's always a question of maintaining player engagement with a long game that I had to work to do that, to make sure that everybody was engaged and really enjoying themselves, because that's the purpose of playing a game. The combat system was a well-established combat system, but nevertheless, we had to make some changes mid-game because there were some unanticipated situations, in particular regarding surrounded units that the game system, I think, didn't really contemplate. Had to make those adaptations on the fly. The communication rules, although we researched them and provided them to the players, I had to make some changes mid-game, particularly because the players were getting pretty clever in using the rules to maximal advantage and probably attaining some capabilities that they didn't really have historically. So we made some adjustments to them, and then we had to make some reminders to the players because they're using email not to send messages to people with whom they were not in contact. There was real life. There's always real life that can take players or attention away from the game. We just had to manage that and had some substitute players step in to or take roles that other players had while they were away from the game. And then there was a question of background knowledge and rules detail, how much to try to teach or communicate to the players. And there was a request after the game or a comment that it would have helped to potentially run a couple of turns just so players could get a sense of how things worked. And if I were to do this again, I think I would do that. But there's a limitation, I think, on how much information, how much you want to try to teach the players beforehand, because the amount of detail can just become overwhelming, and it's really too much to try to digest all at once. A question came up of the realism of the victory conditions that were applied to the game. You saw at the end there that the Union won by defeating the Confederate Second Corps, but at the same time, you had Lee, Longstreet, and Hill running free in Pennsylvania. And so it raised the question of, would that really have been acceptable? Would President Lincoln have been happy with that outcome, the defeat of a single Confederate corps while two Confederate corps were running free in Union territory, and potentially not. So that's an interesting question to potentially revisit if I were to run this again. And then finally, there was the issue of playing a Kriegspiel versus playing a board game by email. There was a tendency for some of the players to really drill into trying to play the board game by email, and it's natural. They want to do well, so they want to try to suss out the rules and maximize the performance of their forces. But the general consensus at the end of the game was we might have been better off providing a little less information to the players on the combat system so that they really focused on the operations and thinking about the historical commanders and their operations rather than trying to eke out combat bonuses, for example, according to the rules. Nevertheless, despite these issues, we all worked it out in the end and were able to run the game to a successful conclusion. So now we get to why do this? What's the value of this? What's the relevance of this to modern professional military wargamers? We're in the 21st century. We have modern technology, satellites, drones, etc. Can't we see everything all the time? And the answer is no. That limited information, even today and into the future, will still exist. And it arises from several causes. There could be dispersed operations, limited interoperability of friendly forces, communications interruption, jamming, cyber operations, counter space operations, and the characteristics of certain domains like undersea, space, and cyber domains where you can't necessarily see all of what's happening at any one time. Now, today and in the future, the impacts might be more tactical than operational or strategic, but nevertheless, limited information situations will still exist that I believe can still create the unknown that could give commanders pause relative to operating with perfect information. Using multi-blind gaming can help analysts understand military decision-making and gain insights into how phenomena like limited information can influence behavior and the outcomes of battles. And then in turn, multi-blind gaming can help us show the value of investments that can help solve the limited information problem and try to give clarity to the commanders and help them operate more effectively. So I think that in some, multi-blind gaming in certain situations can have value even in the 21st century and looking forward. So that concludes my presentation, and now I'd be happy to answer your questions and participate in discussion.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was a fantastic presentation. And so there's been a vigorous discussion taking place involving some of your players.
Oh, that's great.
Sort of going through and talking about a bunch of stuff. There hasn't been a whole lot of questions. And the few questions that I've come up with, I think to some degree you've answered them, but I'll go ahead and ask you these questions. First of all, let's start off with the single most important role of these different Union and Confederate commanders, and that would, of course, be the intelligence officers.
That's right.
And the fact that I'm a former intelligence officer has absolutely nothing to do with that opinion whatsoever. Can you tell a little bit more about how you modeled what information they were getting and how they were able to process it and pass it along? So was there any, and how that changed over time?
Yeah, what the player playing the Bureau of Military Information, it was Chris Robinson. If Chris is online, he had command of certain assets himself. He had spies and scouts, and he also controlled the Signal Corps observation station, so he could deploy them where he wanted them and make observations directly. Otherwise, he was getting reports from friendly commanders and sometimes they were cooperative and provided detailed, timely reports, and sometimes not. But he was getting those reports over the course of the game, and the timeliness with which he would get those reports would depend on the communication links between him and the other Union commanders. And so he worked very hard to try to stay on a telegraph line so that he could get direct reports from those commanders in a pretty timely manner. And he encouraged the Union commanders to be close to a telegraph so that they could provide those reports. Likewise, General Hooker was Peter Perla, by the way, was doing the same thing to try to maximize his command and control capabilities. And so the BMI player had control of his own assets, and he was getting the information from the players, and then he would analyze that himself. He would say, okay, I'm hearing from my commanders that they're in contact with the Confederates, or they're observing the Confederates doing this, this, and this in these locations. My Signal Corps guys are telling me this and this in these locations. And I've got spies who are coming back, and they're telling me that 3 days ago they were in General so-and-so's headquarters and learned this. And so now I'm going to put that all together and figure out what's going on, and then send a report back to General Hooker to let him know what I see. And so that's how that was done.
So you were feeding all that information to those intel officers?
Yes. Yeah.
So were they stringing their own? You talked about the telegraph wires and the importance of the telegraph wires. Were they stringing their own, or were they using an established network? And if so, where did that network come from? Did you make up that network? Did you just assume it followed the railroad lines? Did you have historical research on that?
I did some historical research, and in some they weren't laying their own wire. There was some capability to do that, but it was more limited in 1863 than it was later in the Civil War. So they were relying on established lines. Generally, they ran along the railroads, but there was also a line that ran down for folks who are in the Northern Virginia area, Telegraph Road, which ran south from Washington into Virginia, and I think ultimately was connected all the way to New Orleans historically. And so I used the historical telegraph lines and allowed the Union players to communicate on them that way.
Yeah, I used to live near Telegraph Road in Northern Virginia, and one of the things that I've noticed in my travels is that every place has a telegraph road.
Yeah, they were important.
So okay. So who most disappointed you as either a player or a human being in this game? Never mind.
I don't want to call anybody out.
No, the real next question of this is, what part of this implementation were you most pleased with?
I was most pleased with the way that I think I was able to recreate the limited information available to the players, that they really were operating in the environment that the historical commanders had to deal with. I mean, some of the players said that might have made it even a little bit too hard, that they had to sort of figure out, okay, I'm in a limited information environment. I need to verbalize a lot of things that in a normal game where everybody can see what's on the table, I don't need to verbalize, because the guy standing next to me, my co-commander, can see exactly what I can see. So I don't need to tell him exactly where I am and what my cavalry scouts saw, for example. And so that was something that they had to adapt to. But I think it worked out pretty well. And so that's really what I was happiest about.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that reminds me, I've been doing lots of thinking about distributed wargaming since I'm in a wargaming billet now. And one of the comments that I've made, just thinking back on all the games that I've done over the years at the Naval War College and CNA, et cetera, is how much takes place in an in-person game that is what I refer to as implicitly modeled. It's not explicitly modeled. Yeah. And, when you've got two players that are standing over a map having a conversation. They may represent different organizations located in different facilities, different multi-person organizations. And so you have a simple conversation with people pointing at a map that represents an entire panoply of communication methodologies. And as a game designer, you don't think about that, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
You just don't think about it. And that's the drum I've been beating on distributed wargaming is you need to sit down and question all your assumptions and think about all the interactions that take place, not just the ones that when you've designed a game in the past, you had to put in the design document, because there's a lot of other implicit stuff there, communication paths in particular, that you never explicitly modeled, but you are modeling.
That's right. Yeah, no, I agree totally. Yeah, and when you're playing a game in the in the 19th century, and when you don't have nearly the capabilities that you have today, it really comes to the fore.
So did you do anything to model the differences in the staffs between the North and the South? Because like Lee is famous for having next to no staff.
Right.
And whereas the Unions, and later on, especially Grant, had a large staff, so he had a lot of people doing stuff, whereas Lee, I believe Lee's staff was 3 people?
It was pretty darn small. I mean, it's a little bit bigger than that. It was pretty darn small. The only thing I did was I provided for the Bureau of Military Information on the Union side. And so that was an explicit staff role, and that worked out really well. I was really happy with that. But otherwise, I left it up to the players, and so they were free to analyze, spend as much time as they wanted or didn't want analyzing their own intelligence, and then communicating that to their fellow commanders.
Okay, so I asked you previously what you were most pleased with. What would you do differently if you were going to run this again?
I think I might run a practice turn for everybody to allow them to familiarize themselves with the game. I think I would provide less information to the players regarding the combat system, so they didn't get drawn into trying to play the board game instead of the historical game. I'm trying to think of what else. I would tweak the combat rules from the beginning to anticipate the possibility of the things that we ran into in this game: surrounded units, running out of small arms ammunition. Try to clarify that to the players beforehand, so they're aware that there are some limits to what you can do that might not be in the board game itself or typical Civil War games, so that there are some hard limits you can run into if you push your forces too far, and they need to be aware of that, because the real commanders would have been aware of it.
Were there any places in the board game design? You said you used the board game as sort of the engine for the combat model.
Yeah.
Were there any places in the board game design where you just said, not going to do that?
Yeah, well, in particular, the way the board game works is that units and stacks move one at a time. It's an impulse system where it's roll for initiative and then move units one at a time, and that's not how they moved historically. And in the game it recreates to a degree the chaos of the Civil War, which is fine, but that's not how the units moved in reality, right? They were all trying to operate simultaneously according to the intentions of the commanders, and so I created a system to allow literal simultaneous movement. Now, movement was variable for the units, so I would roll dice to see how quickly units would get up and get going, sometimes to the frustration of the commanders. But it was essentially a simultaneous movement system that I created, that in place of what was in the board game. And then, as I mentioned, the rules for combat involving surrounded units, that the game does model that, but I had to tweak that to represent what developed in our situation, and to represent some of those effects a little better.
if I remember correctly, you had finished law school and were back to being a full-time member of the McHugh Gaming Group when we went through our double-blind phase.
Partly because I missed I know you guys played some Civil War games that I missed, unfortunately.
Yeah, the one thing I remember most about that phase was that we were taking board games and we were playing them double blind, usually with two setups with a board in between, and then Brian would sort of do the leaning back and forth on both sides. Exactly. And there was some very interesting discussions. When I started at CNA, I made the comment that I had, I continued under the tutelage of some defense scholars after I left graduate school. Peter interpreted that as just that I went out wargaming. And it's like, no, I'm actually talking with defense professionals about stuff like that. We had a long conversation when we were doing all that about what rules in the board game could we abandon, because the rules were there to create effects caused by lack of information that we were going to create by having a lack of information. Yeah. So it's like, you don't need the rules to compensate for not being double blind if you are double blind.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely.
So so for those of you out there who haven't done this, it's a lot harder than just, I'm just going to do it double blind. You actually have to subtract some rules off to make it make more sense.
Yeah, and I don't know what the game designers of the GCACW board games would say, but the command and control system that they have with the randomness of the movement and the moving one at a time, one might argue that that's to capture some of the effect of limited information available to the historical commanders, but it's in an abstract way. It's not literal the way I did it.
Yeah, and I think it also captures the effect of the real world isn't turn-based.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Although the real world really was at the time of the Civil War really was sort of day-based, because they would operate almost entirely during the day. I mean, there was some marching at night, but very little night fighting.
Right, but there's some people get their act together early in the morning. Some people don't get their act together until noon, and as a result, units are not moving at, they start their march at different times, etc.
Absolutely, yeah, that absolutely happened.
Okay, so I think we've reached the end of this. Sean, thank you very much for coming and talking with us here at Connections Online. When I decided I was going to put together this conference and I sort of sat down and figured out what the structure was, very early on, I decided that I wanted to have you come and talk with do this Gettysburg presentation. I wasn't quite sure whether we were going to put you on a panel of people or whether have you do a solo like this. But, early on, it seemed like it was a tailor-made. It's not that often you have a situation where where a hobby game is played is run in a way like this by a defense analyst with a bunch of other defense analysts and game designers playing the game. So you had a lot of grognards and you had a lot of other people that actually have to think about these things as in the day job. And I wish I had the time to be part of it.
Well, it was a lot of fun. And one last thing I'll say is I will consider running this again sometime. So if anyone is interested, they can contact me. I've got my email address up there, and I'll put a note in Discord. But at some time in the future, I might actually be willing to do this again.
All right. Thank you very much, Sean, and talk to you later.
All right. Thanks, everybody.